thanks for joining for our seminar today. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I'm Warren Kinghorn, co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative, and it's my pleasure to introduce our close Duke faculty colleague, Jeffrey Baker, who is our featured seminar speaker today. Dr. Baker is a medical historian and a pediatrician and a graduate of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Certificate in Theology and Healthcare here at Duke Divinity School. He's also director of the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine at Duke University School of Medicine. A professor of pediatrics and the practice of history, he served for over 25 years as a general pediatrician in Duke Children's Primary Care, with a focus on children with autism and special needs. Dr. Baker's historical work is also centered on child health. As the author of the book, The Machine in the Nursery, Incubator Technology and the Origins of Neonatal Intensive Care, he's a leading authority on the history of neonatal medicine. He's written widely around neonatal technology, also vaccine controversies, and the autism spectrum. But more recently, Dr. Baker's research interests have centered on the history of racism in medical centers and their communities. He co-led an interdisciplinary Duke Vast Connections project in 2018 and 19 called Documenting Durham's Health History, and then for several years has been deeply engaged with Duke University Medical Center's own history with regard to race. And that has culminated in a podcast that we're going to hear about today called Unhealed, a story of race, memory, and a teaching hospital. Dr. Baker's here to speak with us about his work. We may even hear some of this podcast and to be in conversation about how, as Christians, do we think about the importance of history and understanding the stories of our communities. So with that, it's just a great pleasure. Jeff, thanks for being with us, and thanks for joining us for the seminar today.
Thank you, Warren. And thanks so much to all of you for inviting me today. It's nice to kind of get away from the medical school for a little bit and to spend some time with some of you again. I see Jennifer and Melissa from my groups in TMC. So probably others as well that I can't see on the screen because I can't see very much of the screen right now. So really good to be here. And let me go ahead and share my screen. And talk a little bit about this. Okay. And are we good?
Jeff, we're seeing presenter mode.
Yeah, I just noticed that. I meant that slideshow. Sorry, what happened there? Is it still presenter mode?
Looks great, thanks.
You're good. It is great now? Because I still have presenter mode. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, someone grab me, come in the door. Okay, I think we're good. Okay. What I want to do today is talk, yes, I'm going to try to justify why history is important for theological people and health people. We're going to try to start with the question of how we rebuild trust with the public and how that really begins, I think, with learning history. And then I'm going to describe the Trent Center's Unhealed project as an attempt at truthful historical narration. And I hope we'll have time to talk about the theological and ethical questions raised by this, which I would like to think about further. So unless you've been on Mars, you know we're in a difficult place here in all medical schools. Just really unprecedented for many years levels of distrust. People who just are very skeptical of what academic medicine, academic science has to offer. And so far, our main response at Duke, as well as at many medical schools, has been to promote a message like this: research saves lives. There's a lot of good to this message, and it's important that the public understand that research is a messy process that takes a long time. It needs support. But I don't think this message by itself will take us where we need to go. Because there are many people who will hear this message and see it through the filter of their own experiences with medical schools in the past. This is a demonstration that happened at Duke about 20 years ago, dismantled Duke Plantation, another way the Duke family is sometimes remembered. For some people, the message research saves lives might be interpreted as research saves other people's lives. So, of course, as a historian, I think we need to stand back and we need to go beyond that kind of messaging to take the approach that exemplified by this quote that I bet a lot of you have heard of from Alistair McIntyre. I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? really for the last decade, I've been very involved with trying to think about how do we remember Duke's story in the context of its community story. What do we do with our story? For most of my career, I've seen these statues of people like Washington Duke and Benjamin Duke, but not really known very much about them. What story is behind this? Well, I want to underline that as I've learned more about our story, there are some good things to it. I think that the Duke family who created the money, yes, developed the money to fund this whole place because they were essentially tobacco monopolists, dominated the entire tobacco economy in this country for about 20 years. That is all true. But it is true that I think there was a sense that there were very rich people who had a sense of responsibility, certainly in comparison to some of their counterparts today in the tech world. Um, uh, they were Methodists. I think James B. Duke modeled himself on John Rockefeller, not only in terms of having developed a fortune, but wanting to use that fortune for philanthropic purposes. I think we think of the Dukes as somewhat analogous to the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, because when the Duke Endowment was set up, it was not just did not just set up money to build a Duke University. It actually set up an endowment to promote the health of people in the Carolinas. And most remarkably, it promoted the health of both blacks and whites in the Carolinas. That's pretty striking. That's not I think, in fact, the Duke Endowment is the only Southern-based philanthropy that supports hospital care for African Americans. So the year the Duke Endowment was set up in 1924, exactly 101 years ago now, or two, I guess now. So yes, Duke Chapel was built. It's interesting that a black architect was contracted for that, again, showing the Duke's sympathies, or they think like Northerners to some extent, and inviting him. Um, the Dukes also, their first contribution to healthcare is not spent at Duke. It's spent on basically rebuilding and doubling the size of Lincoln Hospital. Here's a picture of the original Lincoln Hospital. Lincoln Hospital was the black hospital funded by Durham's black community. And the Duke Endowment partnered with Durham's black community to expand that hospital. It's a pretty remarkable story. And they really made that hospital one of the best in the country. It's going to come up in the podcast. So I want to introduce that. And then the story, I think a lot of it, I was a Duke medical student. The story a lot of us have heard, is how Duke brought down a, a dynamic doctor from Johns Hopkins, Dean Davison, who basically tried to make Duke a little Hopkins down here. And there was a sense that coming to the South from Baltimore was kind of like going to the global South today. They were seeing diseases like hookworm and TB, and all kinds of exotic diseases. Here's the first group of medical students. And the hospital starts to open in 1930. It has a rocky start because it's during the Great Depression. It has to do some creative things to stay afloat. And Dean Davison actually developed the first statewide Blue Cross plan as part of that response. But it survived the Depression and went on to get bigger in the 1940s and 50s, doubling and tripling in size. And then by the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it becomes a major research institution, sort of leaving behind, expanding from that earlier mission that was very much focused on improving health in the Carolinas to a broader national and eventually international self-image, reaching out to the entire country and world. I think one of the moments where Duke gets onto the national stage was its involvement in the discovery of AZT, along with the Burroughs Wellcome Corporation in the Triangle. And it gets bigger and bigger today. We are now almost dominating the whole campus. So one way we can tell our story is a story of a shift from a little local institution focused on the community into a dynamic, worldwide, worldly respected, best of U.S. News and World Reports kind of institution focused on research. That's one way we can tell our story. That's the research saves lives narrative. But I'm going to argue there's a rival narrative. There's other ways that the story can be told. I didn't really get into this story very much until really about 2017. And I think Robert E. Lee's nose had a role in this. This is the statue of Robert E. Lee in our chapel that was defaced right in the aftermath of the Charlottesville riots in 2017. The statue was actually taken down. But it started making me wonder, why is that statue up here? What's our story behind that? And I've been spending a number of years trying to really explore Duke's history and think about how would that history be told from the standpoint of the community. And I've seen another side to that story you've told. So we mentioned Dean Davison, who started the hospital. Here are his sketches for the hospital. So I shared the Duke Endowment was dedicated to promoting the health of blacks and whites, both races in the Carolinas. That is progressive. But at the same time, it's still doing so within the assumptions, the cultural assumptions of the 1930s, which is that blacks and whites are treated on separate wards. And here are his sketches for the original hospital, which you can see on the top. It says white men's surgical wards and colored men's surgical and medical wards. Harder to tell is that there's actually just many more beds for whites than there are for blacks. And so here's another picture of how the hospital was expanded. So the section on the right, that's the original hospital that served the community during the Depression. This addition, which really has doubled the size, was called the Private Diagnostic Clinic building because it was building with proceedings of money brought in by private patients. And it included clinics, but also more private wards with private patients. Here are some pictures of how patients would have experienced Duke during this period. And we don't have as many pictures as I like. Even though there was no HIPAA police around, there just aren't many pictures. I can't show you pictures of the wards themselves in general. I can show you pictures of waiting rooms. And this is the adult, what's called the outpatient clinic waiting room. This is where people go regardless of insurance status. I should say regardless of ability to pay. Insurance is not going to be an issue till the 50s. And you'll see here that first of all, it is a waiting room that has both. It is biracial, and it is interesting. You do see whites and blacks in the same waiting room. They're not separate waiting rooms. But you'll also see that white people seem to be in line while the African American folks are watching them. What's going on here? Well, what we learned is that this is a clinic where you just showed up without an appointment. Whites were seen starting at 8 o'clock. African Americans were seen after lunchtime. And so the patients who come in at 4 o'clock, they are arguably going to have a harder time getting the same attention as the patients who came in at 8 o'clock. That's the kind of what is sometimes called invisible racism that goes on at Duke. It's not as obvious as in, say, Watts Hospital, our community hospital that was whites only, but it's still it's a different kind of differential treatment. Another kind of less visible racism, perhaps, is that Duke, as I mentioned, opened a private clinic in the 30s that helped it initially to survive the Depression, but initially became a huge revenue generator. This was for patients who were self-pay, very successful institution that generated the money for that huge expansion I showed you. Now, my department is pediatrics, and the story we tell ourselves is that we actually didn't get into the separate ward business. We were the one service that integrated. And I think it's true that was true of our ward, that we had both blacks and whites in that public ward. It was not true of our clinics, though. This is a picture of our waiting area on one day of the week. I presume there's a well baby clinic. And here's the same hallway on another day. So clearly there's some kind of sorting hat mechanism that's going on here that's keeping people separate. I still am very confident that most doctors, I think, or medical students who worked here would have said, yes, we're seeing people in different spaces. That's because it's just what we have to do. It's Jim Crow. But we are treating them all the same. And I think that's the $10 million question, isn't it? Were people in separate but equal treated the same? Some historians have called, by the way, Duke's kind of segregated care deluxe Jim Crow. In other words, people were still in separate spaces, but there was an effort to give African Americans good care in terms of the facility itself. So I began looking around for stories about patients' experiences, and they're harder to get than you might expect. One story I already knew about, and Dr. Kinghorn has known about it too, is a story that actually did not involve Duke, but it involved North Carolina. And we discovered the story. I ended up using in the podcast through this story. And this is the story of Charles Drew. And when you hear the story of why African Americans have not trusted the healthcare system, it's long been one of the examples that often gets mentioned, kind of like Tuskegee might get mentioned, is the story of Charles Drew. Charles Drew was the most famous African-American surgeon of the mid-20th century. Unbelievable figure. He became a pioneer of blood banking technology. And the simplest way to get across how important he was is that in the World War II, the Red Cross put him in charge of its blood banking program. That's amazing. To put an African American in that kind of position at a time when blood is still segregated. Drew protested that and actually left the Red Cross eventually for that reason. But he still had a powerhouse career. He went on and became a professor of surgery at Howard, trained many surgeons, many African American surgeons after that. And that story, he's a very important person, but it doesn't seem to connect to Duke or even to North Carolina. Well, it does. It's the end of his life that connects to us because when in this lower picture, when Drew was at Howard, every year he would, in the spring, he would travel, often with a couple of residents, from Washington, D.C. down to Alabama to speak at the Tuskegee Institute and give lectures there. He was one time, he did that in 1950 and drove all night. I think you probably know why he had to drive all night. He couldn't stay at a hotel. Drove all night through Virginia, northern North Carolina, and early in the morning, the wee hours of the morning, as he's passing through Alamance County, which is 2 counties west of here, fell asleep at the wheel. And his car flipped over, horrible accident. And he was taken to Alamance General Hospital, the hospital in Burlington, and he died there. Um, the story quickly spread that he died because he had been refused blood. And this is just what a powerful story. I heard the story on an episode of MASH when I was a medical student. Uh, what an irony that a pioneer blood transfusion dies because he's turned away because he's not given blood because of his race. It's an amazing story. It's a powerful story, and maybe one of the few stories I knew of African American medical history for many years. But it's not exactly true. And I think probably a number of you know this now, but the story, it actually turns out that that accident was investigated years and years later after being widely told in lots of media. And it turns out we have good evidence that the doctors at Alamance really tried to save his life. He was famous, um, a nationally prominent figure. His injuries were just too severe. He couldn't be saved. And the most trustworthy way to get across why I believe that is his own residents were there with him and they saw what was going on. So how did the story happen where the story began that he had been turned away because he had been denied treatment because of his race? On one level, it's not really, maybe it doesn't need much explanation because this guy's stories really did happen. They just didn't happen to Dr. Drew. But a historian from Duke had come along and she investigated this and she found that a still more remarkable, there's still a more remarkable background to the whole story. Because Spency Love, in the course of doing a lot of research about this, and interviewing people who were just convinced that Drew had been turned away because they remembered seeing pictures in the newspaper about it. She found out that what had actually happened was there were two stories in 1950. One of a black man who died in a white hospital. And, one was Drew. The other one was somebody who's not famous like Drew, uh, a young man named Maltheus Avery. And he's the second picture that was in a book called One Blood. And this is a story I don't think I had not, I never heard this when I was in medical school at Duke. Well, who's Maltheus Avery? Because his story is going to involve Duke. Maltheus Avery is in some ways a more ordinary person, but also a very extraordinary person. He grew up in Henderson, North Carolina, about an hour north of here. Uh, we have a lot of information. Spencer Levin uncovered information about his family, and his mother was quite a dynamo. She was a strong Presbyterian African American who wanted her. She had basically believed in the American dream. She wanted her kids to become doctors. The other two did buy into that to some extent. Malthus was more of a technical person, did good with his hands and mechanical skills. And he was not on the path to medical school, but he enrolled. He was the oldest of three brothers. Served in Okinawa, joined the army in the Second World War. Served in the Pacific Theater. Had a very traumatizing experience. Came back here. Came back after the war, and came back to spend some time in Virginia, then Henderson. Really, honestly, dealt with some PTSD that we could talk about. But he got his life together, and he got married. And he went back to school to NCANT, the African American school that's in Greensboro, just an hour west of here. And the, at the end of his first semester in 1950, this is in December, he'd had a very good first semester. Avery was driving back home from Greensboro back to Henderson, a route that will take him very close to where we are. Um, and he's driving back to see his wife, who is pregnant, about to deliver a second daughter, as well as his 2-year-old. And on the way, he is struck, is in an auto accident as well. And look how close his accident was to where Drew's had been just a few months before. Avery was taken to the same hospital that Drew was. And there he was assessed. He was unconscious and assessed as having a likely intracranial injury. Well, that's not something that doctors and alumnus could deal with. They needed a neurosurgeon. So you had to refer him. Where did you refer somebody at that point? Well, you sent them to Duke. So that's how his story does become intertwined with our story. He was brought to the Duke emergency room by ambulance. And what we know is that he was brought here, he was assessed for about 10 minutes as not being a candidate for surgery. And he was also not admitted for observation because there were no beds on what was called the colored ward. There were beds on the white ward, but not on the black ward. So he was discharged, he transferred yet again after 10 minutes to Lincoln Hospital. I mentioned that's the African American hospital that's close on the other side of downtown. A very good hospital, but a less well-equipped hospital than Duke. And there, as he arrives there, he essentially coded in the emergency room and died. And so this man, this pretty amazing story, just dies by himself on a stretcher with no loved ones around him. This story did hit the papers, and it's promoted by, especially by the black press. Durham had one of the best, most widely disseminated black newspapers in the South. The Carolina Times by a guy named Lewis Austin, who was always pushing back against the more conservative older generation of African Americans. He made Avery his main story, and used this network around other African American newspapers to spread the story around the country. So this story is a really big deal. It goes around the country, and I think as I learned this story, and I shared this with Dr. Damon Tweedy. This is sort of how we're getting to a podcast about how he had that idea. I had been thinking about the idea of doing a podcast that was about the history of Duke and its community. I'd been doing a lot of work with different stories in that vein. Dr. Tweedy, as he got involved in this, because I wanted to have kind of when you do a podcast, I want to do a podcast, first of all, because I decided no doctors read books. So I just decided I was going to do a podcast instead, because you listen to a podcast doing something else. And I was learning a lot by podcasts in this time period. Thinking of a podcast, we learned when we hired a producer that you need to put a podcast around a central story. We began to think about what would that be. And it was especially Dr. Tweedy's idea that maybe instead of doing a broad theme on Duke's story and its community overall, we should focus the whole thing around the Avery story. We raised money, and I'm very grateful for support from the Trent and Biddle Foundations, as well as the Duke Institutional History Project in the beginnings. But this went way beyond those beginnings, and thought more and more about centering it on the Avery story itself. We have just lots of questions about this. What else could we learn about Avery? What was his story before and after? How was the story remembered by his family? How did Duke respond? How did the country respond? What else can we learn about this? And here's a picture of Avery's wife, as well as his two daughters. There's the second daughter, was born just a week after he died. So this we did do some initial pre-approval with Duke, and we then started to try to reach out to see whether we could reach out to anybody in the family. Our initial thought was we knew that Avery had two younger brothers, and they sounded quite remarkable. One became a doctor, one became a healthcare administrator, and we knew from Spencer Love's work that both had actually, essentially, their lives had changed because of the death of their brother. They basically spent their life, challenging segregation and its consequences in medicine. Well, sadly, they had both died before we could even reach them. We couldn't reach them, so we started to look for other members of the family, and we eventually. And there's a long story behind this that especially Damon was involved with. Lots of doing social media and reaching out to all kinds of routes. We found out that there were Dr. Parnell had two daughters. And we were able to reach them by an email, and they were in Houston, Texas. Both, by the way, pretty high-powered people. One is a head of human resources at Rice. The other one is a Hollywood screenwriter. So we got an email to them, and they wrote back and said, "Okay, we'll talk to you." We set up a Zoom call in spring 2022. I don't think we had thought enough about how this is going to feel to them. Um, and we were thinking about, wow, this would be a powerful story to tell. Wouldn't it be powerful if the family could be involved? But we were really opening an old wound. We really were. And when they told us, and this is on the podcast because we later got their voices on it, they said that their first thought was, why now? Why so many years later is Duke doing? What are we really up to? What are our real motivations? And it was a pretty tough conversation. Something we didn't know that was very important was that their father, both their father and one of their uncles, Maltheus's two brothers, had actually come to Duke in 1990. They were invited by Spency Love, the historian I mentioned. They were expecting an apology from Duke Medical School, and there was no apology, no meeting. And they were upset, distraught, angry by that, and they never forgot that. That was a wound we didn't even know about, we had walked into. So Vita and Sybil we said, do you want us to stop this? They said, no, go ahead, but we're not sure if we're going to be part of it, but go ahead. We still want you to work on this. So this whole thing became a lot bigger than we ever imagined because they were skeptical, but they said if we do anything, the one way they would be involved would be if Duke would make some kind of acknowledgement. It's not just about telling a story. I'm saying what they most wanted, and we had later conversations, it was not direct compensation or any kind of revenge. It was that Maltheus' story would be remembered. So you might imagine we began a lot of conversations. I felt like for the next couple of years, I was meeting everybody at all kinds of levels of Duke, talking with Duke leadership, community advisory groups, all kinds of things. Um, so a lot of work on that side. This slide, I could make a whole talk out of it because so much happened here. But over 2 years, I'll finally say after a long period of us working on doing research essentially for the podcast and starting to script it, we still really weren't sure how it would play out. And finally, there was really a climactic meeting by Zoom in fall 2023, where for the first time, Vita and Sybil let us talk to Maltheus. Maltheus is the younger daughter of Maltheus, born a week after he died, and she's the little baby born in that picture. The Sybil and Vita as cousins have been kind of protecting her, but they had decided that our intents were honorable. Our intents were sincere enough that they wanted at least for her to get a chance to be involved. So we met with her, and it was a tough meeting. A lot of questions about our motivation. Again, were we going to get grant support out of this, whatever. But in the end, that meeting ended with Maltheus. I'm going to show you a picture of her grown up a little bit. She said, they all turned to her and said, what do you want to do? And she said, well, because we basically said, do you want us to stop this? Do you want us to stop? Which is not easy to do. I'd worked on this for a long time. But they said, Maltheus, or Maddie is who they call her. Maddie, what do you want us to do? And Maddie kind of she steps away and steps back and she says, I want to do it because I think my grandmother would want me to do it. So that was the turning point of the whole thing. Maybe one other, and you should have taken my blood pressure after that moment, but and about a month later, I actually met with Maddie in Atlanta, had coffee together first, and then later on, we would actually bring her to Duke for an interview, basically close the podcast. In parallel were all the conversations with Duke, and they were all going around in circles until really, I have to say, Dean Klopman, our Dean of School of Medicine, did get behind this. And she could see we were going in circles. In the spring of 2024, she said, we just need to get these people in the room at the same time. And we had a meeting with President Price, herself, the head of the CEO of the health system, and the communications people, maybe the most important of all. And they agreed that Duke would support the podcast and would have a plan to put it out and acknowledge it. So that led into the final phase of the podcast where we took our research and our writing and we did scripting, worked into the recording studios. And that was being done I guess that was really started in 23. And Here's a picture of Maltheus, Maddie, now who came to Duke. Before we did the interview with her, she actually we took her to Duke Hospital where that old emergency room was, the old entrance to the emergency room area that I showed you in the other picture. And she spent time there. We also took her to Lincoln Hospital on the upper right, which is gone now. There's just a site that marks where it was. And Damon and I accompanied her there, and her cousins are like texting us the whole time saying, don't screw this up. This is really important for her. This is like closure. But she told us this was really powerful for her, really powerful to spend time. And then she did give an interview, and that's the final part of Unhealed, where we let her essentially close the whole podcast. So my mouth is getting dry because there's so much emotion behind all this that is just hard to convey when I tell it as a PowerPoint. But the podcast, we finally did get everything done, and it turned in and got it set up online. It was completed in September of last year of 24, I guess, and then released in early 2025. And there it is. If you want to get a sense of what it looks like overall, the best thing is to go into unhealed.duke.edu, which I think was on the last slide. And you'll just see we have basically a list of all the episodes. There's transcripts and everything. But I hope that some of you will take time to actually listen to it. If you have a long car ride, this is a really good. I think this could be very powerful. We just address a lot of questions here, and I'm not going to kind of go through and summarize it all. I just want to give you a sense of why we could use a one-man story to bring up a lot of bigger issues. Why spend so much time in a story that happened this long ago? How does this play out as a story for his family, and how do we balance that story with a sort of a national story, a bigger story of racism? How did Duke respond, and how do we judge that response? And ultimately, why do we need to spend time learning stories like this today? Rather than give you summary overviews of all those things, because I welcome questions on any of those points, this being TMC, I've got just a couple of things I'm going to share just with you. Because one thing I thought, I finished this while doing the TMC hybrid. And let me first of all say that this was a hard process in the last year. And the support of people in TMC, Dr. McCarty, Dr. Kinghorn, and Dr. Curlin, that was really important for me. It was really important. And the support of some of my classmates in hybrid mattered as well. Now, it may have opened my eyes a little bit, and certainly a comment of Dr. Kinghorn opened my eyes to this. There was a lot of Christian talk, a lot of Christian language that we encountered. So, for example, when I looked at how did the public respond to the Avery story, thank you. My throat always sounds like this, by the way. It's pediatric throat in January. IGA at work. Okay. So anyway, we found lots of newspaper accounts of this because it was a national story. White papers, when we reported, tend to report the story as just kind of a bad thing that just happened to happen to Duke, a breach of individual conduct. Black papers almost universally would cite systemic causes, the segregation system. And what I thought was especially interesting, they would very commonly cite, refer to scripture. Here's one example. Lewis Austin, I mentioned, was the editor of Durham's Black Paper. He's also a big time Christian. And his editorial on this was called "No Room at the Inn." He's alluding, of course, to the Christmas story. And that's picked up by an editorial page in the Baltimore Afro-American that shows headline, "Still no room at the inn in some places," showing Mary and Joseph on the top, and the lower right is Maltheus Avery being turned away from Duke. You can find lots of examples of that in the black press. Here's one more example, a letter that came from the student body president at NCANT, which is where Maltheus had been in school. And he wrote Duke's president, "We are no position to pass upon the efficiency of the medical staff at Duke Hospital. But in the light of this incident, we are forced to wonder if this staff has ever heard of the Hippocratic Oath." Okay, we expect that. "And the teaching of the Nazarene." Interesting, right? When I share this with medical students, most of them don't know who the Nazarene means, but obviously there's further language. It's very clear what these students meant. So I found that interesting. One of my favorite stories I didn't get to talk enough about in the podcast because Dr. Tweedy thought I was going off on kind of on a rabbit hole. There's this character named Jim Dabrowski. Jim Dabrowski is a really interesting Christian activist that you've never heard of. He who gets involved in this whole story. He went to school at Emory, was offered a very lucrative position at Coca-Cola. He turned it down, went to seminary instead, and he basically spends the Depression becoming an activist. He wrote a book on Christian socialism, and it's pretty wild. In 1950, he is running an organization with a very boring name. I think it's like the Southern Conference Educational Foundation. A boring name because he didn't want it to be exciting. That's essentially doing racial justice work. And he's a Methodist pastor, and he reads the reports of Avery. And he says, there's never been a campaign before about segregated wards and how they affect Black people. So he does a big survey. He sends surveys to every hospital in the South. How many beds do you have for whites? How many for Blacks? What do you do when there's an emergency like Avery's? Duke president gets that survey 3 or 4 times. They never return it. He collects stories and publishes them in a booklet. And the booklet becomes, to my knowledge, the first time there's been a compilation of stories of the tragedies caused by hospital segregation. It's called The Untouchables, and it's not real beautiful. Think of this not the equivalent of a beautiful book, but the equivalent of social media, 1950 style. A cheap booklet. He sent out 10,000 copies of this. We know that Eleanor Roosevelt read this and wrote about it in her diary. And these kind of stories are the tip of the iceberg. We can actually read responses. Duke's President Eden's got letters from all over the country. And again, I want to thank Dr. Kinghorn, especially for prodding me to notice this thing. But so many times Duke was not criticized just for so much of its medical care, but was criticized because we were a Methodist school. We should know better than this. Here's an example of a letter from a woman in Michigan, and she writes about how, she said, we just talked about this story in Sunday school. And this is just outside of Detroit. And she just takes President Eden's to task. He says, your hands are no doubt tied by biased, non-Christian, anti-colored factions on your board. But it will be fine to see somebody in the South have guts enough to answer this atrocity to the colored people who were born here. Feisty letter. So really fascinating to read all these kinds of stories and how, again, they're making this, they are really thinking. Duke is thought of as a Methodist institution. That's why it's criticized. It's not a critique simply based on systemic racism. So I want to open things up for questions, but I know that one question folks are going to have is, what have we really done for the family? Remember, I mentioned they had wanted acknowledgement as part of this. And you might imagine that when this came out in February of 25, it was not a time when Duke was really excited to promote this story outside of the campus, right? It's just, it's a time where social media is doing all kinds of terrible things and taking messages like this and spinning them in really difficult ways. But Duke, and I'm very proud of this, I was able to find allies. Duke's a complicated place. And I found some really good people at high levels of the Duke administration who were very deeply moved by this. One of the vice presidents named Ian Brown in particular. And he got the ear of the highest level people. And that led in the end to a memorial being constructed for Avery. And it's a pretty impressive memorial. You can see it's big. It's not behind a closet or behind a rock. It's at the main entrance into the Duke Clinic. And you can see there's a really nice pictures of Avery. And underneath the picture on the far left of Avery is a plaque, which is by the family, just in memory of all the family members who were affected by this story. And then there's some quotation from the Duke mission statement, which is actually, it's a very fitting kind of connection, that this story is here for us to think about as we care for patients. And the bottom is a QR code to learn more through the podcast. And on December 2nd, the 75-year anniversary of Maltheus's death, the family came to Duke and were brought back. And although it was a small event, it was not covered by the press. The head of the Duke Health System was there, the dean of the School of Medicine. They gave pretty powerful remarks. Most impressively, Maltheus, the daughter, and the two nieces, Vita and Avery, both gave their own remarks, and they were their own remarks. They were not scripted, and it was sort of the most moving experience I've ever had at Duke as an historian. I've never seen anything like this. So at least that's one thing I cling on to. I'm not really sure what the future of this is as a podcast or how easy it will be to get word around, and what will happen. I can share thoughts about this, but I feel at least this was something tangible that did come out of this for the family. So I think what I'm going to do is let me just share the words of mouth that Maltheus uses to close the podcast, which take just a minute, and see if that plays. To close by giving the final words to Maltheus Avery Blake McDowell, the daughter of World War II veteran Maltheus Avery, about why this work matters.
I'll tell you why I came. I came for Hazel Avery, his mother. I came for Nanny Bell Jackson Avery, his wife. I came for my sister, Evelyn Holland. I came for Dr. Parnell Avery and Lieutenant Colonel Wardell Avery, his brothers, who wanted acknowledgement of what happened that night. I came for his sister, Evelyn Avery, his father, Napoleon. Yeah, it's another story. Okay, here we go again. But it's generational. It's passed on. And it affects from that December 1st of 1950. Here we are, and it's being passed on. It affected the lives of his wife, his children. It tore families apart. It's generational. That's why, yes, hear the story. Talk about the story. Don't cut it off, because somewhere in your family, there is a story that needs to be told.
Okay. Thanks so much to all of you for your attention, for taking time to spend on this story. I know it means a lot to Maltheus and any family members that people are hearing this story. So thank you.
Jeff, thank you so much. And I'm always moved when I hear Ms. Avery say that at the end about that there's stories in our own families, because I know that that's true of mine. So thank you for this and for sharing this and for sharing in some ways how the family is continuing to participate in the telling of the story. We have one question and then we'll open it up to others. Sophie Hartman asks, how did you decide to do this type of historical work and storytelling? How would you encourage others interested in pursuing such work? And let me just add to that a little bit. Like, why is this kind of historical storytelling important for Christians specifically?
Yeah. And many people have said, why is it not enough just to say acknowledge that segregation was bad, right? And then let's put our energy into moving forward and doing things better. Why spend time not only acknowledging the past in broad terms, but really getting very specific? And I think you get a sense that it's not easy to do this. It takes a lot of work. I feel that something changes us when we hear a deep story like this. I can show you a picture of segregated wards and say there were differential outcomes because of that. When I hear a story like this, it works on my heart. And I found that's true for many other people. It it makes a step out of our preconceived boxes, I guess. Um, and as a Christian, I really believe we have to not only do better in the future, but we have to start by acknowledging, by confessing. Um, that's a point that I find many of my white colleagues have a hard time getting. I even find that quite a few medical students have a hard time getting it. It's kind of more like let's move on, let's do things. Um, uh, and I know many students who are very attuned into the possible harms of telling a story like this too. But when I talk to people in the community, especially African Americans, I almost always I almost always get the reaction, this was really important to do. And it's really important that this story got told. Yes, there are many other stories to be told, but this was important.
Yeah, thank you. There's a moving comment in the chat that I won't read out loud from Carol Siebert. So thank you, Carol, for sharing that. Jennifer Herbst also has a question for you, Jeff. Did you get any sense from Mr. Avery's family whether or how their faith helped them make meaning of his death?
Um, they it kind of took a while. I think they were kind of guarding that part of their lives a little bit. And sometimes you get a sense that people are Christian, but they're just not saying it because they're just out loud. But I just really had a sense of these folks. I guess there's just something about how they carried themselves and some graciousness that came from them. So it was a while, I'll have to say, before I realized that. I really don't know much about the brothers and their faith. But I know that for this generation that's out there, yes, they are very sustained by it, especially Maltheus, who I heard the language he used is very church soaked, shall I say.
Hmm, thank you. I would invite anyone else to either post questions in the Q&A or if you wish to just use the Zoom hand raise function under reactions to raise your hand and I'll call on you. If you want to ask questions live, we could do that also. Any questions from the group as a whole? Yeah, Chandra, yes, you're welcome to unmute and ask.
Sure. Hi. Well, I just wanted to make at least a comment to have some initial reactions, and pardon me for not being able to turn on my video. But I really enjoyed your story. I have also heard many similar stories just anecdotally, but from very prominent individuals, including, for instance, Elijah Cummings, the congressman who actually passed just a couple of years ago now. He often tells a story of him being interested in healthcare equity after his father suffered from a massive heart attack, and he overheard the physicians after he passed saying it was okay because he was just a you know what. So he overheard physicians commenting about the life not being as precious because of the color of his skin, and he would often tell that story as a reason to why he wanted to help address healthcare inequities. But also, I graduated from a historically Black institution, Bethune-Cookman, and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune actually helped desegregate hospitals like Johns Hopkins because she was best friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. And Mary McLeod Bethune needed a procedure, a particular surgery that, of course, folks at Hopkins were good at. And they initially refused care, but because of her attachment to Eleanor Roosevelt, she was able to be seen at Hopkins, and she was the first sort of Black woman to have that experience, if you will. And so there are plenty and plenty of stories, and I have my own as an African American woman who lived, for instance, with her great great grandmother whose parents were enslaved. Although I'm in my 40s, I have firsthand stories of lots of differential treatment. So I do want to underscore the importance, as someone mentioned in the chat, of telling the stories because otherwise they might be erased from history and then we'll have a tendency to downplay its effects that are clearly still reverberating even to date. So I just wanted to really make a comment that this was a great presentation and I resonated with it a lot. And there are a ton of these stories. I really wish we could, incorporate some systemic changes to help disrupt the biases that we all know still exist. As Christians, I think we're obligated to understand that no one's better than the next. And we all deserve, of course, care. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that comment. And I'll just share that after George Floyd, I don't know how many talks I went to about building trust with the community. And they would try to explain it in one slide. Usually there would be about the Tuskegee study. And my intuition from talking to a lot of people is that that story is kind of a placeholder for the fact that many families have stories that they know within their own family and community of direct discrimination. It's just that those aren't widely recognized. So those stories are in the family. And we need to recognize that as doctors. We're not telling people that our community knows this story specifically, although some do, but that they know a story. They know other stories.
Jeff, thank you so much for that question and response. Jeff, I think we have time for one final question, and there's a question that's been posted in the Q&A from Andrew Kim, and it's a fitting question to end on. Have you felt any hard emotions when running into the roadblocks and sharing this story? If so, how have you worked and reflected on those emotions?
Yeah, there were different hard moments. I think you kind of sense when they were, but in some ways, one of the very hardest was actually the time when it was actually released, because there really was going to be a plan of disseminating this, and we kind of knew that Duke Communications had a plan to respond. And the February of last year was just Duke was not going to do that. It was it was a very different place. And that was just really, really hard. And there's sort of a sense that we're sharing this within Duke, but not using public channels at all. It feels good to have it out there. So I was very discouraged. I was glad to be part of the TMC track at that time, although there's a lot of homework that didn't help at the same time either. But I was glad to have that community. I'm in a better place now, actually, because of the memorial coming up. I wasn't sure if that would happen back in February. I thought the whole thing might go down. So I'm in a better place now, but that was a really hard moment. And so leaning on people. And I think some of the folks, Warren, I'm going to name you, I'm going to name Brett, I'm going to name Patrick Smith. They're individuals. A disproportionate number of people in the TMC program have been really supportive of this. And I'm really grateful for that. My small
Thank you.
group. Jennifer's
Thank
even
you.
my small group and came back.
I would just say I was also privileged to be present at the memorial dedication in December, and it was also, I would echo, it's one of the very most meaningful things I've ever seen or been part of in my career at Duke. So thank you all for sharing in this seminar. I would encourage you to both listen to the podcast if you haven't also, and also to share it and to disseminate it, because I think it's important, not just for us here at Duke, but for everyone connected to American healthcare. Thank you so much, Jeff, for being with us as our seminar speaker for today. Really grateful for you and for your work and for your leadership throughout the university and the Trent Center. And for all of you, I would say, please continue to join us for these TMC seminars. Our next seminar will be on February the 6th, when we welcome Rick Donlin and Susan Post from the Christian Community Health Center and Esperanza Health Center to present on the topic of the long defeat. And with that, go in peace. Thank you so much for joining us today.